What is going on, guys? Welcome back to another video. Today we are talking about a position that causes a massive headache in fantasy hockey, and that position is goalies. The problem with goalies is that there's so much variance year to year when it comes to their performance. And we saw last season elite goalies that got drafted super high be massive disappointments in fantasy. This is why for today's video, I'm going to be explaining to you guys why you shouldn't draft goalies very high and why spending high draft capital on a goalie is very risky. With that being said, I'm going to be discussing that, but I'm also going to be discussing my favorite goalie targets, the goalies that I'm avoiding, and my favorite strategies to employ in a points league and a category league. The first thing that I want to say, and I know I sound like a broken record here, but you need to understand your league settings. The fact is that there's a lot of differences between a category and a points league, and that's going to change how I draft goalies. For example, guys, I'm in a keeper points league, and just the way the commissioner set up the point settings, goalies are not heavily valued. So you definitely don't want to go out of your way and draft a goalie with high draft capital. But in another league with my high school buddies, the way that the commissioner customized those settings made goalies very powerful. What the commissioner did in that league was reduce the weighted value for shots, hits, and blocks because he felt like it was too much, but he didn't reduce the weighted values for goalies. So goalies show up in the top 50 rankings quite a bit, and they now have an edge. With that being said, guys, check the season rank for your goalies. If a bunch of goalies show up in the top 50 or even the top 25, then you know goalies are heavily weighted and you don't necessarily want to avoid them in your drafts, okay? Like I said, guys, league settings can complicate things in fantasy hockey. It's very annoying to do making content, but I am trying to educate you, and you're going to learn, by the way. If you're new to fantasy hockey, you're going to learn which settings matter and how it impacts your drafts. With all that being said, though, there are key distinctions between a category and a points league and key strategies that I follow in those leagues, regardless of settings. So let's break down the difference between a category league and a points league when it comes to goalies. In terms of a category league, volume is not nearly as important as a points league. It depends what cats are counted in your league, but if you're looking at default Yahoo category settings, it counts save percentage, goals against average, wins, and shutouts. If these were your settings, then I don't necessarily prioritize volume. Like, I don't care about goalies that are going to get 55 plus games. Yes, it can help a bit, right? Because I want to get wins, I want to get shutouts, I want to get goalies that play, but in terms of these settings, like, I want to prioritize goalies on good teams that are going to have a good save percentage and a goals against average. This requires you to be very strategic in starting certain goalies on certain nights, and sometimes you don't want to start goalies at all in case that it might ruin your cats. So that is something that is way different than points leagues. For most points leagues, volume is extremely important, and you need goalies that are not in 1A, 1B situations. No, you need a goalie that is going to get 50 plus games or 55 plus games. The idea in a points league is that you want to maximize your points, so you want to get as many goalie starts as possible and hope that they perform. This is why I say that fading goalies is not necessarily the most viable strategy in some of these points leagues, because having a goalie that's going to get a lot of volume is going to give you an edge. That being said, though, in a points league, I ideally want to find a guy in my 5th, 6th, 7th, or 8th round that's going to get a lot of volume that I'm going to get a lot of starts out of. For example, guys, in a category league, Petr Mrazek is not a good goalie. Yes, he had a good save percentage last year, but starting him may ruin your week because of his goals against average. Before we talk about the fantasy points, you can see that Shesterkin had a 2.58 goals against average and a 913 save percentage, which was definitely better than Mrazek's 3.05 goals against average and 908 save percentage. Yes, they had similar save percentages, guys, but in a category league, Shesterkin was much better, and he was much better to rely on week to week versus Mrazek. With that being said, though, in a points league, the difference in value between Shesterkin and Mrazek is not necessarily that far off. If you look at total fantasy points among goalies last year, according to Yahoo's default points league settings, we can see that Shesterkin was 5th in total fantasy points. Now, this is good, guys, but Shesterkin is always going as the first goalie off the board, and in my opinion, he is just not worth it in a category league or a points league. But if we look at Petr Mrazek's total fantasy points, this paints a very clear picture as to why you should probably fade goalies early. Mrazek was 14th in total fantasy points. Shesterkin played 55 games and Mrazek played 56 games, so Mrazek only played one more game than him. So this difference is not that big, especially if you compare some other goalies as well. I mean, looking at the difference between Shesterkin and Mrazek in fantasy points, that difference is 103.2 points. That was almost identical to the difference between Sergei Bobrovsky and Jake Ottinger. Ultimately, this is a problem with goalies. Like, Shesterkin's going as the first goalie off the board. There's no upside to his ADP. Mrazek's going way later, who may get a lot of volume. And you have guys like Bobrovsky and Ottinger who vary year to year that are going very high as well. We can also look at some other goalies here and see that Jordan Binnington had more total fantasy points than Igor Shesterkin. Binnington went way later than Shesterkin in most leagues last year, but he provided a lot of value in points leagues because his volume was great. His goals against average wasn't as good as Shesterkin's, but his save percentage was just as good. He started more games, and he faced more shots as well per game. Like I mentioned earlier, volume is very important in points leagues, and we're seeing a shift in the NHL where less goalies are playing 60 plus games, and that's making certain goalies much more valuable than others. I mean, if you just look at last season, only 3 goalies played 60 games or more, and if you just go to a year like 2014, 2015, you could see that 12 goalies got 60 games or more. The fact is that with this volume going down across the board, goalies like UC Saros are going to have a massive edge in your points leagues. If you're looking at Yahoo default points league settings, you can see that UC Saros has been the best goalie in 2 of the last 3 seasons. In 21-22, he was first in total fantasy points. In 22-23, he was also first. And then in 23-24 last season, he was second. This was only behind Connor Hellebuck, but the fact is that Saros has been an absolute stud because he's played the most games out of any goalie in the last 3 seasons. And the Predators also let a lot of shots against, so the volume is amazing. This is why I've been such a big fan of drafting Saros in points leagues, and I've taken advantage of this knowledge in previous seasons and exploiting Yahoo ADP because Yahoo ADP only takes into account category settings for their mock drafts. That's how ADP is reflected, and last season, Saros was the 8th goalie off the board on Yahoo, so in a points league, he was sick value. Unfortunately, this season, his value is not as good. He is the 3rd goalie going off the board with an ADP of 27.5. Very steep price, guys. I still like him more than Shesterkin in points leagues, but yeah, very steep price. And in a category league, you probably don't want to draft Saros as high as well. So something to note. But in general, guys, volume is king in points leagues, and you don't want to draft tandems, those being goalies in 1A, 1B situations, in points leagues. A lot of new fantasy hockey players will do this, or casual fantasy hockey players. They'll be playing in a points league and they'll draft 2 goalies on the same team. And in my opinion, that is putting you at a disadvantage. This is especially the case if you have ads throughout the week, because in some weeks, you're going to have one of those goalies on your roster only playing 1 game. I would much rather pick up a streamer that has 4 games and 4 off nights that's going to help me maximize my points than having a goalie sitting on my roster that's only going to get 1 game that week. I will say, though, that if you're in a category league, having a tandem on a good team is pretty solid. If I'm in a category league without saves, and even with saves too, but in general, without saves, it's even better, I am good with having Freddie Anderson and Kochetkov on my team. Having tandems on good teams in a category league is going to be beneficial, but in a points league where you need to maximize your points, it's not. In conclusion, guys, if you're in a points league, don't draft goalies in tandems. It's going to put you at a disadvantage, and I would much rather draft goalies that might be on a bad team, but are going to get way more volume. Now, before I tell you guys my favorite goalie targets, I want to talk about the strategy of fading goalies and what that looks like in a category league and a points league. Starting off with category leagues, what I'll say is that in pretty much any category league, I'm fading goalies until my later rounds. The top tier goalies are not worth it at their ADP. There's too much risk. There's too much variance. And yeah, I'm just not a fan of drafting goalies very high in category leagues. With that being said, though, if the value is too good to pass up, then I would definitely consider drafting goalies early. It would have to be like Shesterkin falling 2 or 3 rounds for me to consider drafting him. Ultimately, guys, volume doesn't matter as much in category leagues. And what I want to do is get those leg goalies that I consider steals that I'm going to talk about in a little bit. And if they don't pan out, that's fine. Like, I can stream goalies on the wire. There's always gems on the wire throughout the year that I may end up holding on to. There's always going to be injuries, guys that outperform the number 1 goalie and end up getting more starts. And you can find these guys on the wire, pick them up, and hold on to them. Some of these goalies only may last a couple of weeks, but you'll find new ones. You'll find more viable options on the wire. And depending on how many ads you have in your league, a completely viable strategy is just streaming goalies. Streaming goalies that are playing against bad teams that are going to put up good stats to help your categories. That's definitely a better option than wasting a high draft pick on a goalie that might not be that good. Now, in terms of my strategy with goalies in points leagues, I want to say that I am not necessarily fading goalies in these leagues. Ideally, I still want to find 2 goalies who are the number 1 starter on their team and who are going to see a lot of volume. However, in general, in a points league, I'm still looking to fade goalies in my early rounds because there's so much risk and because there's so much variance. In general, in points leagues, I'm going to avoid these early goalies unless they fell like a round or two to me, like Saros or Hellebuck. If they fell a round or two, then I would definitely consider drafting them in a points league. But yeah, I want to fade those early goalies and get those late round steals who are still going to see a lot of volume. I said this in the category league section, but if these goalies in the later rounds don't pan out, you can find goalies on the waiver wire that could potentially be studs. Last year, we saw goalies like Connor Ingram, Ukko-Pekka Luukkonen, Charlie Lindgren, Joey Decord, Alex Line, and others be really good, and those goalies largely went undrafted. I do want to say, though, that relying on the waiver wire to find goalies is a little more risky in points leagues versus category leagues because you want to maximize your points, and you need to try to get as many goalie starts as possible. So ideally, you still want to find those volume goalies in your drafts and hold on to them, but I just think there is better value in the later rounds than the early rounds. With that being said, guys, here are my favorite goalie targets in points leagues. And as you guys can see, my two favorite goalies to draft currently are Adin Hill of the Vegas Golden Knights and Ukko-Pekka Luukkonen of the Buffalo Sabres. For me, I just think Adin Hill is a guy that's going to see a lot of volume now with Logan Thompson gone. The Vegas Golden Knights have a very good defensive structure that benefits goalies, so Hill should have really good numbers. He's going to be good in a points league and a category league. So at his value currently, 8th, 9th, 10th round, that is pretty darn good. With Ukko-Pekka Luukkonen, I'm pretty high in the Buffalo Sabres this year. I think they're going to bounce back. And even last year, they weren't that good, and he still put up good numbers. So, yeah, I'm a fan of him in both a category league and a points league, but more so a points league because I'm expecting good volume, lots of shots against, and he's just really good value at his current ADP. There's other goalies I like as well in these later rounds. Not as much as Hill and Luukkonen, but I like Linus Ullmark of the Ottawa Senators, Joseph Woll of the Toronto Maple Leafs, and Darcy Kemper of the Los Angeles Kings. I just think these guys have good volume potential, 50-plus games. They could have good stats as well. The Leafs are a playoff team. The Kings could be a playoff team once again. The Sens could bounce back. So, in general, I think at their value, with the strategy of fading those early rounds, these are pretty good. Now, in terms of some other goalies that I like in points leagues that are going very late, these goalies are Connor Ingram of the Utah Hockey Club, Petr Mrazek of the Chicago Blackhawks, and Dustin Wolf of the Calgary Flames. There is some concern that Ingram may not get the volume that you want, and there's a chance that last season was a fluke, but I think the Utah Hockey Club have a lot more trust in Ingram than Vejmelka if you're just looking at the numbers from last season. And Vejmelka is also in the last year of his contract. So yeah, I think there's a good chance that Ingram still gets 50 games or more. And at this price, on a team that is pretty good, that could have a chance at making the playoffs, I think Ingram is pretty solid. With Mrazek, I already talked about him, but there's a chance we see 50-plus games once again. The Blackhawks are not going to be a playoff team, guys, but they could improve from last year with some new additions. Second-year Bedard, Bertuzzi, Teravainen, Hall returning. So yeah, I mean, at this ADP in a points league where volume is very important, he could be good value. Now with Dustin Wolf, a little more risky here. He is a rookie. He has looked good in preseason, but the fact is that there's not a lot of risk in drafting him this late at an ADP of 168.5, and there is a chance that he sees very good volume. So in a points league, he could be pretty good. Those are my favorite goalie targets in points leagues, but now I want to talk about some of the goalies that are going earlier and give you my take on them. I think for me, Shesterkin is just way too pricey. He's not worth it in a points league or a category league, but especially not a points league. So yeah, I am not drafting Shesterkin unless he fell quite a bit. Other goalies I don't love the price of is Jake Ottinger. He may not see 60 games. He is on a team that doesn't necessarily let a lot of shots against, so that volume isn't there either. And he was just shaky last year. So I don't know. I just don't like his ADP at 30.5. I'm just not willing to do that when I can find those later round steals. Another goalie I don't necessarily love is Sergei Bobrovsky. You could see his volume go down. He is getting older. And like I said, goalies, there's a lot of variance, and this could be a down year for Bobrovsky. So yeah, I'm just not a big fan at his current price. Now, in terms of some goalies I wouldn't mind drafting, these goalies would be UC Saros, Connor Hellebuck, Jeremy Swayman, and Andrei Vasilevsky. All these goalies have the potential to play 60-plus games, see a lot of shots against, and in general, just be really good in points leagues. So, like, I would love to have them on my team, but very steep price, and I don't know if they're worth it. Another goalie I want to talk about here is Jacob Markstrom. I like Markstrom, and I think the Devils are going to bounce back in a big way, but usually goalies on the Devils are better in category leagues. The reason I say this is that in the last couple of years, they have not let a lot of shots against, a lot of points leagues, value saves like Yahoo default, and this puts Markstrom at a little bit of a disadvantage. So I don't love that, and I also don't love the fact that they have Jake Allen there as well, who may eat into his games. With that being said, I wouldn't mind drafting him in a category league at this ADP, but not really in a points league. Another goalie here is Demko. I'm avoiding him due to injury because he's dealing with this weird injury that he doesn't have a timeline to return from. So yeah, I just think there's too much risk at this ADP, and I wouldn't draft him unless he fell super far. Now, in terms of the rest of the goalies here, we have Ilya Sorokin of the New York Islanders. I don't hate this ADP. Like, it's not the worst thing in the world, but I obviously have some major concerns with him. Last year playing so bad, losing starts of Varlamov. We saw Patrick Waugh seem to prefer playing Varlamov than Sorokin, so that was definitely concerning. And then we got news a couple of weeks ago that he had back surgery in the offseason, and he is still recovering. He should be ready for the home opener. But in general, I just have some concerns, and I'm not going to be targeting him unless he fell maybe 2 rounds or 3 rounds. The next goalie here is Alexander Georgiev. I talked about him in my avoid video. There's just too many red flags, too many concerns. Bednar is talking about reducing his workload, so the volume might not be there. Bednar is sending high praises for backup goalie Jessica Noonan. Georgiev's in the last year of his contract, and we've seen what the Avalanche have done with their goalies. Like, they probably don't want to sign him long term. They don't want to pay the price for him. So yeah, I just worry that like near the end of the year, the second half of the season, like there may be a timeshare with him and a Noonan, or even a Noonan becoming the #1 guy. So I'm just not a fan at this ADP. The last goalie here is Stuart Skinner. I wouldn't mind drafting him at his ADP. I still would like it if it was like in the high 50s or the early 60s, but I think the Oilers are going to win a lot of games. You don't have to worry about him losing starts like you did with Jack Campbell. And I think he's built a lot of confidence, not only with the coaching staff, but himself as well. I still would prefer to draft some goalies later like Hill and Luukkonen, but if he fell to like the 6th round, like I wouldn't mind drafting Stuart Skinner. Next up, I just wanted to highlight 2 sleeper goalies. One of them being Artur Shilovs of the Vancouver Canucks, and the other being Jessica Noonan of the Colorado Avalanche. Appreciate the comment on my last video telling me how to pronounce his last name, Shilovs. Thank you very much. But this guy, with Demko dealing with this injury that has no timeline, he could be the #1 goalie on the Canucks, and we know that the Canucks are a pretty good team. His ADP on Yahoo is currently 168.6, so not a lot of risk, lots of upside, and he's worth taking the late round flyer on if we continue to get not the most promising news about Demko. Another goalie that I like is Jessica Noonan of the Colorado Avalanche. I wouldn't necessarily advocate drafting a Noonan in a points league because you may have a couple of months where he is only getting 1 game a week and you're just wasting a roster spot on him. But in a category league, he may be really solid. So yeah, if I'm in a category league and I'm fading goalies, which is what I am doing in a category league, a Noonan is a guy I'm looking at. If you watch my most recent video, I talked about a Noonan in there. But what I said in that video is that Coach Jared Bednar has had very good things to say about a Noonan, and he's talked about reducing Georgiev's workload, a Noonan playing really well. And we also know that a Noonan had much better stats than Georgiev last season in the limited games that he played in. So yeah, he could be an absolute stud and a very good sleeper. All right, guys, that is the end of the video. A lot of videos coming out this week, guys. We're going to have a must-draft defenseman video. We're going to have an updated sleeper video for you guys because some things have changed in training camp. We're going to have training camp updates, some other stuff as well, guys. So stay tuned. Subscribe if you're new to the channel. Hit that like button if you enjoyed it, and I will catch you in the next one.